Hey, Luke here at the eDrum workshop. I hope you're having a great day. I did a big acoustic drums versus electronic drums video a couple of weeks ago, so if you haven't seen that, I would highly recommend watching that one before you watch this one. I basically tried to recreate my acoustic kit inside my Pearl Mimic Pro drum module. We recorded a Tama Superstar Hyperdrive with a pork pie snare and Amedia cymbals with a very basic microphone setup and entirely no processing on the drum recording. Then I matched this setup the best I could with the tools available on the Mimic. This week I thought it would be fun to apply some processing to both of these kits to show off how they can sound if you do some basic EQ and compression and throw on a little bit of reverb. And it's kind of surprising how they've turned out. So I'm going to go straight to the examples in a moment, let you hear them back to back, and unfortunately the comparison footage is the same as last time, just processed. Though that intro clip was an unused one, and I'm even going to throw in some unused snare wires off footage from the acoustic kit because I think it sounds cool with the processing applied, but I didn't capture any of that for the Mimic. Then I'm going to do a quick run through of what I did to each kit and talk about the differences a little bit, and finally I'll play it out with a head-to-head comparison of both kits processed along with the track that I used on the last video so you can get a good feel for how that sounds now too. I'm just going to start on a quick unprocessed clip of each kit for reference, and then it'll all be processed from there onwards. Let's get to it. So, as you can probably hear, I haven't gone to as many lengths to try and make these sound as close to each other as I did on the unprocessed versions of these kits. I started with the intention of doing so, but it became apparent quite quickly that the differences between the compressor and the reverb inside the Mimic, and the ones that I own and like to use in Reaper, my digital audio workstation, were quite large. That's not to say it couldn't be done, but to be honest, I wasn't going to find it very fun to trawl through all of the plugins that I have, just to try and find the ones that are sonically similar to the ones inside the Mimic. And ultimately, I wanted to have a bit of fun with these sounds. So I tried to keep the principles similar, but I didn't aim to make them as identical as I could, so that I could actually enjoy the process. I'm going to give a general outline of the approach that I took to each of these, and then I'm going to finish it up with the full track comparison. So with the acoustic kit, I mostly used the PSP MicroComp on the kick mic and the snare mics, the PSP MasterComp on the overheads bus and the tom bus, the built-in ReaComp plugin on the direct tom mics, and some Ozone 5 plugins. Their EQ on pretty much everything, the exciter on the toms and the snare bottom, the reverb on the snare and some on the overheads to expand the room sound a little bit, and then I used their maximizer plugin just as a general limiter on some of the buses. I also applied some kit-wide EQ, compression and the maximizer on the full drum bus using those same Ozone and PSP MasterComp plugins. I just seem to get really nice results out of those PSP plugins on drums. I've tried a few different ones, but I always end up coming back to them as I find that their presets are really handy for getting me in the right ballpark for what they say they're going to do, and then I'll tweak from there. I don't think that you should rely on presets alone, and you definitely need to learn how these things work, but if a plugin has really well-defined presets that help you speed up your workflow, I'm all for it. My general approach to the EQ on each drum was just to try and find a way of fattening things out a bit, and to remove some of the excess ring on the snare. Personally, I quite like how wild my snare is, but I was trying to aim for a little more of a conventional drum sound, so I went quite heavy on dipping the frequencies that I thought were a bit much. I did go a bit heavy on the reverb on the snare, just because, no pretenses here, I thought it sounded cool. It's kind of overkill when you hear the drums on their own, but it works well in the mix in my opinion. And then with the electronic drums, the bulk of what I did here was remove the EQ that I applied on the Mimic originally, that I used as a way of roughing the sounds up to make them sound less perfect. Then I compressed everything individually, did some EQ on the snare to try and do a similar ring control as I did on the acoustics, added some kit compression and a little bit of kit EQ, cranked the reverb on the snare to try and match the kind of level on the acoustic version, brought the room mics back up a bit, and sent some of the overhead and room mics to the reverb too. Nothing super fancy, but I wanted things to chunk up a bit, so I tried to get them where I thought it sounded quite fat. The main difference in the approaches here is that although the Mimic lets you EQ and compress every microphone individually, there aren't any group or bus compression or EQ settings except for the one kit-wide one. In the context of the Mimic's use, this isn't really a problem. You don't typically need those things in a live situation, and if you're recording with the Mimic, you're probably routing everything out individually and then you could apply those things in your DAW, or you'll be capturing the MIDI performance. It was a useful thing for the acoustic drum mix though, because using these plugins on a bus can just add to that overall fatness, and it also helps each section of the kit sound a bit more tied or glued together if you want that effect. The most noticeable differences sound-wise to me are on the snare drum and the cymbals, much like with the unprocessed version, but for kinda different reasons. Once I removed that EQ that I'd originally used on the Mimic to rough it up, the snare was so much more punchy and controlled from the off than the acoustic snare. However, I didn't get the bottom end of the Mimic snare as fat sounding as my acoustic snare. I didn't really want to go cranking the low end load, so I probably could have pushed it a bit further if I tried. There's also just way more detail in the Mimic samples compared to our recording, especially on the top end of the snare and the room and overhead mics. A little bit of that on the snare will be down to removing some of that ring, but to be honest, it's mostly due to the way it was recorded, and there wasn't really a great deal I could do to my acoustic snare to try and emulate that. If I tried too hard to boost that, it became more obviously artificial and it was kinda gross sounding. So I decided not to push in that direction and just go with something that I liked. The cymbals are just completely different cymbals, and again have been recorded differently in a completely different sized room. Did I say different enough there to get the point across? And then the reverb is actually the last thing that I noticed making a large difference. The Ozone Reverb plugin has a bunch more options for room types and a very different, more sort of airy sound to it than the one inside the Mimic. The Mimic's reverb is a little more rudimentary, and although I could have probably spent a long time making them sound closer together, I did actually like how it sounded with the Mimic's kit. They're not the same sounds, but each of those reverbs feel like they suit the sound of the drums that they're paired with. That and the fact that there's all that extra top-end detail in those Mimic samples means that the source sound that's going through the reverb is not at all the same as the one that's going into the Ozone reverb. So there's always going to be differences there too. So that's the general gist of what I did and why. Let me know if you want any more detail on this kind of thing. I can either make another video or I can just chat to you about it. Make sure you pop a like on the video and subscribe if you've enjoyed it or learned anything. And let's just jump straight into this final track. Cheers!